This episode of Where Did the Road Go is brought to you in part by our Patreons. In particular, this month is being sponsored by Lindsay Marie Trebet and Nick Martin. I thank you both so very much. And if you want to become a patron, you can do so at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And now our show.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Seriah.
Welcome to this edition of Where Did the Road Go? And today I welcome back Mr. Walter Bosley. How you doing, Walter?
Pretty good. How you doing today?
All right. I just almost completely finished. Like I told you, I have about 15 pages left on your book here, The Esoteric Napoleon, which is your fourth secret missions book. And
yes, and
go on.
Oh, I was just going to say, and it's only volume 1 of that.
Right.
How many? Turns out.
How many are you planning?
Just for Esoteric Napoleon, only 2.
Okay.
Basically, the second volume will cover things that I just didn't have I used the first volume to lay the foundation for my hypotheses on Napoleon. So the second one will get into those juicy details that this one could not.
Now, personally, I've never studied Napoleon. You know, I know different things in passing, but I've never really looked deeply into him. And this is a very interesting book. I mean, partially because I don't know that stuff. So, you know, there was kind of a dual layer there. I think people who do know about Napoleon will find it interesting because you're getting into a lot of stuff that may have been spun differently by the mainstream.
Right. As a matter of fact, I expect it to be split among the people that are familiar with, the life of Napoleon. I fully expect to at least get half the people who will hate the book and will say that it's a bunch of malarkey, and I'll get the other half of those familiar with Napoleon who will say kudos to you, or there's even stuff that they might not have known, because that is what I found to be the case where Napoleon Bonaparte is concerned. He's one of the most slandered men in history, and it's really interesting. I was like you. I honestly, all I knew about Napoleon was what we learn in school, what we see in movies and TV shows, and all the caricatures of the man. And this was my first serious study of him, and what I found was not what we're taught in school or in the movies. I found a fascinating, complex, human, witty, admirable person, not a tyrant, not a despot, basically a man whose reputation has been the victim of 200 years of mostly British and European oligarchical propaganda.
So people who aren't familiar, what are your secret missions books? Like, what's the concept behind them?
Right, yeah. The Secret Missions series is a series of books that I have been doing, wherein I will look at an historical figure. Now, I don't go out there looking. Here's how this happens. I don't go out there looking for who will be the subject of the next Secret Missions book. What happens is, in the course of my research on other things, I will... of course, there will be people who will pop up in that. For instance, Juan Cabrillo was the subject of the first book, and he's a very important figure in the Age of Exploration. And what happens is I'll see something that makes me wonder, what was that guy really about? Because there's either something weird in the case of Cabrillo. His birth is undocumented. We don't know anything, officially about his birth. And then also his death was kind of a mystery. And so those two things really piqued my interest in him. And when I dug into him, I discovered that, wow, this guy was kind of a mystery himself, but I think he was, he was on a personal quest or some type of, hidden embedded quest in his known historical exploits. So that's how the first book happened. And then with Burton, I was a longtime admirer of Burton. But what happened was I was reading a book about something else entirely, And I happened to read that there was this about 5-month period in Burton's life and his career that the details are virtually unknown. He never said or wrote a thing about it. And I thought, wow, that guy was one of the most prolific people as far as writing about what he did, to the point where some of his books are flat out boring. They're in such detail. And yet here he is, this 5 months, he didn't write a word. And where was he? He had disappeared into the Amazon jungle in Brazil. Well, wow. Okay. That was loaded. So that, that ended up being that book. And then, of course, Ambrose Bierce, there's mysteries about him. But what's the through line in all these books, including with Napoleon, is Cabrillo, Burton, Bierce, and Napoleon. These are men who, when you look at their lives and what they did, they all shared an interest in ancient history and in archaeology and things like that. And the details of their lives reveal what appears to be, for each one of them, a quest in search of the lost history, or more specifically, the lost technology of a forgotten civilization from long ago. And in each one of these men's lives, you see the thread of that quest through their lives. And so that's really what the Secret Missions books are about, looking at a historical figure who had this personal quest embedded within their known historical exploits, a secret mission, if you will.
Okay, all right. I love that concept. The lost civilization stuff always fascinates me.
Oh yes.
And so let's get into a little of the misconceptions of Napoleon before we get into what his secret mission may have been.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think are the most glaring ones? I mean, obviously the one of him being a tyrant is one of them, because that was always the impression I got, that he was this very tyrannical sort of leader.
Oh, of course, and a megalomaniac. Mm-hmm. And just all sorts of stuff. When it was a tyrant, a despot, a megalomaniac, and there you have it. That's all you needed to know about Napoleon, and that's pretty much how they present it. But then you actually look at the man's life, and you immediately begin to see, oh, wait a minute, there is a context here that makes all the difference. And the context, looking at the context, requires to know the truth, to learn the truth about Napoleon. You have to look at who his enemies were. Okay, you have to look at who didn't like him. You have to look at who was saying these things about him. And what you come away with is the House of Este, okay, a major, powerful dynastic house in Europe, from which was drawn pretty much all the major monarchies of Europe, and particularly during Napoleon's time, okay, including England. You have the House of Este in Europe, and you have England. Now, England, basically, what they saw was this, man who was considered to be an upstart general, okay, who had won the hearts and minds of the people of France and a lot of the leadership, who was put in power and was actually doing things for his own country. And when he was forced into war, and that's another thing that is part of this, basically he was doing things and accomplishing things that England was jealous of. England wanted to be as successful and powerful as Napoleon Bonaparte. Every leader in England wanted to be as charismatic and as intelligent. He was a very intelligent man, very well studied. That's something that you don't get to hear about very often, because they have to constantly remind you that he was a tyrant and a despot and a megalomaniac. So what you had were other powers that were essentially jealous of what he was accomplishing. Now, when he took power, when he was put into power, I should say, and it was a result of a coup, because France was a mess back then, politically, he had like 5 years to work on France and improve France, and he did it. He transformed France into a much, much better place. Now, we hear about the the famed Napoleonic Wars. Okay, well, there were, I think, 9 of those, and 8 of them were started by his enemies. Okay, the way you learn about it in school, Napoleon was this warmonger going around starting all these wars that was responsible for, all this death and destruction. And actually, he only initiated one of them. And on top of that, these wars, it wasn't just that war was declared on France. These wars were directed at him personally. War was declared on Napoleon Bonaparte himself. They would say this. So basically, when he got into these wars, he started invading countries. Okay, and he would go in, and after conquering the country, he would then lay down, kind of like with his civil code and the economic vision that he had. He would make these places better for the people of those countries than they were before he conquered them. Well, this, of course, pissed off the oligarchy. All right, this goes back to, this was the Age of Enlightenment. Okay, and already the new young United States had embarrassed the British Empire by gaining its independence. Okay, so England, was still kind of sore over that, and that was greatly a product. That was a product of men influenced by the Age of Enlightenment. Okay, now Napoleon Bonaparte, he was also one of these Age of Enlightenment guys. Okay, and he loved the United States. He loved America, the idea of it, and England is seeing him guided by these Enlightenment principles. Okay, doing great things for his own country, and then when he's forced into war, the countries that he fights and invades, he's starting to lay down a new foundation based on Enlightenment principles. Well, England didn't want that because their master was the oligarchy, and the European oligarchs didn't want that either. So that's really at the core of why, in their opinion, Napoleon had to go. Napoleon had to be destroyed because what he was doing was threatening their good thing. The European oligarchs in England, he was threatening their good thing. And, in the long run, what happened was Napoleon Bonaparte can be credited for putting the final nail in the coffin of the feudal system, essentially. Okay, even though Napoleon, he got run out and everything, still their thing was over as far as the powers of monarchies and dynasties. So he did succeed in that regard, but it's a very interesting story. Like I said, you have to look at who his enemies were, and then you get a much clearer picture as to who Napoleon was, what he really was, and why we've been fed this, like I said, this slander and propaganda for 2 centuries.
Okay, and yeah, it's really interesting as you lay this stuff out to see just how much they hated Napoleon. I mean, have we ever had wars fought against just one person like that? I mean, because that's essentially what it was. They were wars to take down Napoleon.
Yeah, I mean, even during World War II, when we truly had an a-hole to go up against, an Adolf Hitler, that guy was an evil bastard, and the war was declared on Germany, not on Adolf Hitler. So there you go, and that's one of the points that really stands out starkly. Even before the Napoleonic War era, while he was in Egypt, the British were involved in attempts to assassinate him. So, it's really, I came away, and you'll notice in the book and in my subsequent commentary when people ask, I really came away with a disgust with the British aristocracy in a way that I never had before. Studying Napoleon just makes you angry at the British, official England. Here's the thing, even the British people then, they were being told that Napoleon was this monster who will eat your children at night and that kind of thing, but they were scared to death when they bring their Bonaparte exile to England, they didn't let him get off the ship. They were scared to death to have Napoleon be exiled in England because they were afraid he would win over the people and get sympathy. Yeah. Okay? People loved this guy. His soldiers loved him. Okay? It was the aristocracy that feared what he represented and hated him and, needed to destroy him and ruin him.
Okay, so you talk about Napoleon looking for the remnants of a lost civilization, lost technology, lost knowledge, stuff like that, and that being part of the reason he ended up going to Egypt. But before he went to Egypt, he went to Malta, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah,
because Malta is one of those...
Malta was, of course...
Go ahead.
I was just saying, Malta, of course, was the step towards... It was where he wanted to mount his expedition to Egypt. But yes, he had reasons to go specifically to Malta, yeah.
And Malta has its own sort of lost civilization stuff going on that we don't really understand. You mentioned the Hypogeum and how it wasn't excavated at the time, but that maybe he was looking for it. And the sacred...
Well, I think the Knights of Malta knew about it.
Okay, yeah. And they let him in.
Sure, they welcomed him. Essentially, I mean, the knights there, the command level of the knights and the order, they essentially welcomed him. The resistance that they supposedly put up was just a formality. I think he had based his expedition to Egypt on a plan that had been submitted 20 years before. The French government, called the Directory back then, had been submitted several plans by various individuals over the course of 20-some years. And what Napoleon did was he took one in particular that impressed him with its basic concept, and he fit the details to his own vision. But instead of staging it from Crete, the island of Crete, like the original plan suggested, he chose to stage his from Malta. And I do think that's entirely because the Knights of Malta were there, and because of the remnants of an ancient civilization there. And yes, I do think there's no way that the Knights of Malta spent centuries on that island and did not discover the Hypogeum. There's no way that they spent all that time there and didn't know about these things. I think they knew about them, and because of a known Hypogeum and that kind of technology, ancient technology, in Egypt, okay, Napoleon, of course, would have been interested in seeing what the Knights of Malta knew about it at that time. And that's why I argue that, the Knights of Malta knew about it. If I'm right about that, then I think they probably showed it to Napoleon while he was on Malta. In fact, I do think his primary purpose for going to Egypt was his secret mission. I think Napoleon Bonaparte very boldly used he used the benefit that France, in their vision of empire, would gain from having Egypt. Okay, how it would kind of force England to deal with them on its way to India. Hypothetically, I think he used the fact that the whole Egyptian campaign and how it would be good for France politically. I think he used that to gain the resources and the means and what have you to go pursue his personal interests in Egypt. The man was a philosopher-scientist at heart. That's the other thing that really blew me away when I first started studying him. Was he was a philosopher-scientist at heart. All the biographers say that his first love was ancient history, astronomy, all those classic archaeology, all those classic sciences, and the mysteries of the ancient past. And it's evident in his personal studies and his fascinations, and even in his statements and his plans throughout his life. This is what this guy was really all about, And as far as the Egyptian campaign goes, that was a means to an end for him to pursue his personal interests.
And I remember Graham Hancock writing about all the weird stuff in Malta in his Underworld book. Is it Underworld?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes.
He mentions there were elongated skulls found there with only two plates on their skulls.
Mm.
And
Very interesting.
They have since disappeared, of course.
Of course.
Yeah. So, I mean, who knows what that's all about. So, after Malta, when he left Malta, he actually changed the entire island, like the politics of it and such.
Sure. That was his habit. That was his method. He would go in and he freed slaves. He improved the economy. He went in and made the place more civil and better for the people who lived there. He improved it all the way around, and then he took 34 knights plus 17 of their non-knight personnel with him to Egypt. He recruited 34 Knights of Malta. Now, they were all under 30 years old, so they were in fighting condition. But I argue that among those 17 non-knight personnel and among the personnel who were knights, I argue that there were probably archaeologists and other specialists among them, because we know that the orders, they would be fighting scientists, right? Fighting monks, fighting scholars. So the fact that they were under 30, people would say, well, that's the only reason he took them. No, that shows an ignorance for how these particular orders operated. I would say that he selected these men, and we don't know their names that I've found yet. I would say that he selected these particular men, as much for the secret mission as he did for their, ability to fight if necessary.
And he, but even prior to that, selected a bunch of archaeologists and scientists and stuff to take with him to Egypt.
Oh, unprecedented. Alexander the Great had taken, scholars with him. I think another individual had taken scholars with him, but Napoleon took what was it? 167 known and respected scholars in astronomy, engineering, archaeology, you name it, all the technical and anything that philosopher, scientists, alchemist types, and he took 167 of them, and I think and he took almost 500 field technicians in all these disciplines. So it ended up being 500 or more, basically scientists, okay, field scientists, and philosopher scientists among them, and he treated them on the same level as he did his officers in his military. In fact, some of the officers were mystified and frustrated that they were having to share quarters with an archaeologist. Okay, so this was unprecedented to take that many people down there. Now, you could argue, and it's argued that, well, he just did that because he wanted to transplant Western European civilization in Egypt. Okay, yeah, and they did do some of that. They improved roads, and they built this, that, and the other, and they essentially established Egyptology. Okay, the historical discipline of Egyptology was established by Napoleon's expedition. Yes, they did do that. Those things, the building the roads and improving the conditions, but they spent a lot of their time searching ancient relics and gathering the relics of the past and trying to figure out the mysteries of the civilization down there that was lost. And I came away from my study and research convinced that this was indeed the primary reason Napoleon took those guys and their purpose for being down there.
Okay, and he went to the Sphinx. He went to the Great Pyramid. There is some argument you point out in the book as to whether or not he actually entered the Great Pyramid.
Yeah, that was kind of hilarious, as I say in the book. One guy who is the author, J. Christopher Harold, who was the author of Bonaparte in Egypt, which is an awesome book. As a matter of fact, that's the book that kind of kicked off my Napoleon research. I happened to have been in a used bookstore in while visiting my good friend Joseph Farrell. And there it was on the shelf, one copy of Bonaparte in Egypt, a book that I had heard about, but I hadn't read, never found. And there it was, so I bought it. And it's an excellent, there's just a goldmine of information about his expedition down there. However, Harold is one of those who says that, Napoleon never went inside the Great Pyramid or any of the pyramids, but particularly not the Great Pyramid, because there was this tunnel and he would have had to have crawled through it. And, essentially the implication is his ego wouldn't have allowed him to do that. And I've got these other biographies, and there's a contradiction there. So I dig into Harold's sources, and Harold got that from Bourrienne. Now, Bourrienne was a school friend of Napoleon's when they were young, and Napoleon had early on hired him as kind of a official secretary, personal secretary. Well, Bourrienne was an unethical kind of guy. He got fired by Napoleon, I believe, twice for his lack of ethics and his corruption, okay? And he became bitter at Napoleon. And most historians for a while now have recognized that Bourrienne is a very undependable source on Napoleon Bonaparte, the stuff he wrote afterwards. Undependable. And one of those things is that Bourrienne said, he would not go into the pyramid because, he wouldn't crawl through the tunnel. This comes from Bourrienne, who's just, making this stuff up because he was angry at Napoleon. So when you dig into the other biographical material, all the other sources, they have a date that he was cited coming out of the pyramid, because a messenger came to him to deliver him a message about the Turks arriving at Abukir Bay, and all the other historical sources say Napoleon was given the message when he emerged from within the Great Pyramid with a couple of his associates. So, the other biographical sources clearly, have witnesses that say, well, of course he went into the Great Pyramid, and it wasn't the only time. So the fact is that he spent, the better part of a year, in Egypt, maybe a little. I'm trying to remember the exact months there. It's been a couple of months since I have looked at this stuff. But he spent a longer time in Egypt than people think, and he was around Giza, the Giza Plateau, on numerous occasions, sometimes would camp out there, okay? So it was obvious that, not only had he gone inside the Great Pyramid on that day, but that he had, gone in there more than once. And, what's intriguing is, the fact that he went in there, what was he looking for, what was on his mind, and of course we have this legend that he had a very weird experience in the king's chamber.
Yeah, where does the legend come from?
That comes from primarily one original source, and that was, I guess what you'd call kind of a steward / personal bodyguard, a young Arab who was the one who greeted him when he came out after Napoleon had gone in there and been in there all night, spent a total of 7 hours inside the king's chamber. And when he emerged from the pyramid, according to this one source, he was pale, he was shaken, and, the fellow asked him, well, what happened? And he says, well, I saw something, but never mind, you would not believe it. And that's it. That's the legend. Now, we can't, unfortunately, prove the legend through any, letters of Napoleon's or anyone else's. All we have is this, what amounts to an apocryphal tale. However, we do know that Napoleon was there. We do know that he had access to these pyramids for, several months over the course of his expedition. And we do know that at least specifically on one occasion, they had him coming out from the pyramid the day he received the message about Abukir Bay. So when you take that, what is known, okay, you can better analyze the apocryphal tale. You can say, okay, well, the truth, could very well be somewhere between the two. Okay, was the young Arab bodyguard embellishing, the drama of the moment, or was he not telling the truth? Well, again, the truth might be somewhere between the two. We know he was in the pyramid. Maybe he definitely spent a night there. Okay, and then the rest of it is embellishment. But the known facts support looking into the apocryphal tale and giving it serious consideration, which is what I tried to do in the book.
Mm-hmm. It's I've heard that legend for a long time.
Yeah, it's been around.
Let's talk about what you think happened to Napoleon in there.
Yeah. This of course is the first major speculation of the book. And what I did was I said what I was just talking about. Okay, we have the apocryphal tale. We have the known facts that yes, he indeed would go in the Great Pyramid. So it is not unreasonable to assume, for the purpose of the discussion, that he indeed spent at least one night in the king's chamber. Okay, even tourists, pay the tour guide a few extra bucks to lay down in the granite box, right? So
Right.
Here you have Napoleon Bonaparte. If he wants to spend a night in the granite box, he's going to do it. So so we take that assumption and say, okay, let's say he did spend the night there. Let's look at what he was interested in. Let's look at what happened after, he would have spent time around the pyramids. And, is there anything to extrapolate, something from that suggests that there was some type of experience? And that's essentially what, I was doing with my speculation. And what I found was Gaspard Monge, his mentor. Now, Gaspard Monge is credited with being the father of descriptive geometry, and he was essentially a philosopher-scientist who, older than Napoleon, and was very much a mentor. He was Napoleon's closest confidant on the Egyptian expedition, and essentially before and after on these issues. Okay, what really ignited my fascination with Monge in this mix is that there is this thing credited called the Monge point. And that is essentially, for us regular guys who aren't mathematicians, the Monge point has to do with tetrahedral geometry, a tetrahedral pyramidal shape, okay? And essentially, my best understanding of it is that the Monge point is that point inside that shape where multiple planes can be accessed, kind of like an intersection of planes. So you have that Monge, this is the kind of thing this Monge guy was thinking and working out, okay? And then you have this story that Napoleon Bonaparte spent a night in the Great Pyramid, which is not exactly a tetrahedral, this, that, or the other, but it is a pyramidal structure. You have the story where he spent a night in the ever mysterious and essential king's chamber, and we're told that he came out after having some weird, mind-blowing experience. Well, this is where I get the idea, is the king's chamber, is specifically that granite box that people call a coffin, no body or mummy was ever found in it.
Right.
Is that essentially where one finds the Monge point, so to speak, of the Great Pyramid? In other words, it is that coffer, that granite box, the point where the human consciousness can tap into multiple planes of reality, of the metaphysical planes and stuff. And is that what happened to Napoleon?
And you think he may have seen some of what was coming?
At the very least, I am willing to, definitely stand by that he at least had some, this is the very least, had some incredible lucid dream that he came away convinced that what he saw was future possibilities. Okay, at the very least, he came away believing that he had seen a vision of what he could accomplish, in Europe, based on his civic vision, his political vision, and he wasn't really primarily a political animal. He really wasn't. He had a genius for municipal organization and civic organization that we find out later. But I think he can, and that's at the very least that it was some type of lucid dream. Now, let's go a little bit farther out on the limb of speculation, so to speak. Let's have fun with this. He could have had a waking vision, exactly, of his future, so to speak. Whatever it was, according to this one tale, it really just got his attention and blew his mind. So, from there I go into, there's the intentionality work of Tiller, that we can read about in an excellent book by Joseph Farrell, Macrocosm and Medium. And did Napoleon, after this experience, did he come away with the ability to apply intentionality and through that be better equipped and better able to make these things happen that he was accomplishing, that he was achieving? And is that what really scared the oligarchs and the British oligarchs among them? This is what I come away with in looking at this one apocryphal tale and the people and the details that are known surrounding it.
Do you want to explain the intentional stuff for people a little bit?
Oh, I'm not an expert on that. That I'll admit that section of the book was the most technically careful of, as far as specifically technical details. That was the most difficult part of the book because I wanted to make sure I was saying what I needed to say properly. Mm-hmm. Essentially, my understanding of intentionality in this is that human will, the will of the human consciousness can make things happen. It's just that classic, in more colorful terms, you might call it, psychic powers or whatever, but it's essentially that when one applies intentionality, it can change the what am I trying to say? It can change the it can alter reality. Mm-hmm. in a very almost sloppy way of putting it. It can okay. Let me give you a fictional analysis here. Okay, we've all seen the original movie Wrath of Khan, Star Trek Wrath of Khan, right? Mm-hmm. And when they're talking about the Kobayashi Maru test, what do they say? They say Captain Kirk cheated.
Right.
What did he do? He got in and he changed the circumstances of the test so that it wasn't a no-win situation, right?
Right.
Well, through intentionality, a human being applying intentionality, they can essentially manipulate the circumstances to their favor. Okay, and that, like I said, I admit I am not the expert on intentionality and such, but that's my understanding of what Tiller's experiments and such are saying, and what I think Napoleon attempted to do, and apparently with some success.
Okay. Let's talk about the sacred resonance idea, because that applies to both Malta and the Great Pyramid.
Yes.
And there are definitely acoustic properties to the Hypogeum and the obviously the Great Pyramid, and a lot of ancient sites like sound seem to be a big mm-hmm. part of the technology that they used.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I again, this was in that section of the book that I admit was I was the most careful with that as far as the technical aspects, because it's something that I'm not an expert on. But this is a major piece of evidence that Napoleon was likely made aware of or knew something about the hypogeum on Malta, because the resonance that one can establish or raise or whatever in any hypogeum is the sacred resonance. If I'm remembering my own book correctly, I think that's the big clue right there. And we know that the hypogeum with small h, and those existed in Egypt. In fact, that technology likely came from Egypt before whoever built it on Malta built theirs. So that to me is a clue that that we're talking about the same civilization, lost, forgotten civilization, and also a clue that Napoleon was likely aware of the hypogeum. And what the sacred resonance, what this suggests and what it does is that it, when activated, it would hypothetically create the, I don't want to reuse the word circumstance, it could create the condition for this experience that Napoleon had, right? In other words, it created the condition for his subconscious to tap into that intersection of the different planes and see what it is he saw. Now, I was talking with a young man yesterday in a conversation, a guy named Marshall, who, the way he put it, I really liked. He said that it's like a musical scale of the piano keys where, you tap one down the scale and it has a counterpart up the scale, if I'm describing that correctly. And you could be located at down the scale, but then tap in with your consciousness to the resonant partner key up the scale. Okay, so what the sacred resonance does is, again, creates that resonant condition for the subconscious to then, through that resonance, as a conduit, as a medium, carry the consciousness to that so-called mange point. Okay, so I think that's something that Napoleon understood, had learned about, understood, and come on, he had Gaspard Monge, his closest confidant there. So certainly Monge is telling him, hey, try this. This is what I think. Let's tap this thing here and get this resonance going. We don't know how much they actually knew about the Great Pyramid. I mean, consider the research of Christopher Dunn with the resonators, in the Grand Gallery that he theorizes. So already there's been researchers that have recognized that, this pyramid, something to do with resonance there. I think the fact that we're even talking about sacred resonance and its association with the hypogeum, the fact that there are hypogeums in Egypt, to me, this makes it clear, even more clear, that it is a safe bet to speculate that Napoleon went to Malta to learn, for various reasons, but primarily this would have been involved in it because he knew what he was going to try to do in the pyramid before he left. And how can I say that? Because of the presence of Gaspard Monge in his life and on that expedition.
Okay. And after that, he went down to Syria, but this is also part of what we now consider Egypt. Is that correct?
Syria is, what we call Palestine and, Jordan and Israel and all that stuff. In those days, they just called that Syria. And, of course, there is, and I don't mean to discount or play down or eliminate the military or the political activities that Napoleon was involved in on this expedition. Those all happened. Those were all legitimate. Yes, that was part of what he was doing down there, of course. I'm not saying that, that's all a lie or that was just, no. That was all part of it. What I'm saying is the very nature of when I write about a secret mission is, I take a figure who was doing these very legitimate known historical things that are true or that did happen, and those were things he had to do. But the secret mission was the personal quest, using the known things as a means of, also pursuing the personal quest. And this is what Napoleon was doing in Syria. Now, Syria, was kind of a really choppy campaign for him. There was just stuff that happened that really, it sucked. It was not that great. And, mistakes were made, of course. But when you dig deeper, you find out that it appears that he went to Petra, which implies, again, a knowledge of something that wasn't allegedly discovered until after Napoleon's time.
Right. And that, of course, is another lost civilization connection.
Yeah, the Nabateans. And that is something I have to say, the details of why I think he went to Petra, the implications from that, and the whole thing about the Nabateans and stuff, that is Volume 2 material. I will definitely be getting into that in Volume 2. But what I did was I laid the foundation and showed how the guy who later was involved with, Petra when it was discovered, that guy's father may very well have been an officer on the expedition with Napoleon.
Okay, so let's get into the Paul Winkler theory. This was a little disturbing.
Yes, it is.
You want to outline that a little bit and who he was?
I don't know much about Winkler himself, but his book was written and originally put out in 1937. Now, the edition that I used as a reference was a 1943 edition, which was, 4 years into World War II, by the time Scribner's and Sons published that edition. But the book was written in 1937 and was out there, which makes it even more disturbing. And basically it's this. What Winkler did was to study the history of, Germany, essentially going back into medieval times, back to the basically the establishment of the Teutonic Order, okay? Mm-hmm. And he demonstrates the rise of the Junkers and the whole era of the Hanseatic League, and he basically shows how, and Prussia, the rise of, what we came to call Prussia, which actually wasn't even Prussian. They invaded the Prussian territories and eliminated the true Prussian culture, but usurped the territory and created their own version of what they called Prussian culture, okay? And that became known as Prussian, but it technically is not. But what they did was, what Winkler does in his book is he shows how this usurper culture has a method of taking over a nation, and through befriending one group, using that group, and then when they're done with that group, they then befriend another group and turn that new group against the group they were friends with before. It's very Machiavellian, very Machiavellian. And what Winkler did was he showed how this so-called Prussian usurper culture, the usurper word is mine thrown in there, he showed how through the medieval era, and then again through the post-medieval and, through the Renaissance and right on up to World War II, through the 19th century era that I've written about the Prussians before, and right on up to World War II, he has shown how that culture had been controlling Germany for centuries, and exactly what they do and how they invade other nations, and how they used the Bull of Rimini as a document that would, from their point of view, give them the somehow the legal right to invade territories outside of the German territories eventually down the road. And what's very disturbing about it, here's what really bothered me about it. the model that Winkler writes about and remember, he said this in 1937, 2 years before World War II started, okay? The model that he lays out, how they operate, all right, you can see that exactly in Operation Paperclip and the United States military-industrial complex, okay, and the history of the U.S. since World War II. Even assassinations, the way they would do political assassinations, okay? It fits the JFK assassination. It's very, very disturbing because what the book lays out, now get this, written in 1937, before Operation Paperclip ever existed, what the book shows you, what Winkler shows you essentially, is exactly how this underlying culture from Germany found its way to invade the United States, right, by befriending us using Operation Paperclip, okay, and then urging us to build our military-industrial complex and stepping up the Cold War and blah, 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 and so forth, and all the bad things that would come with that, okay? And it seriously implies how this subculture that was, behind the Nazis right before that, is hypothetically invaded the U.S. and I should say the power structure, the government through this making themselves valued by our national defense apparatus, and then beginning to influence us politically from the inside to the point where then they're really, in a way, pulling the strings that they want to. And essentially when they're done with us, they'll, befriend someone and turn them against us. And here's the problem with Winkler. Damn it. He does not provide footnotes or references. But when you look at the parallel, the history that's out there that is referenced, it fits. Okay? It fits, it jibes, it rings true. But yes, it's unfortunate that Winkler just, footnotes, Mr. Winkler, damn. But here's the thing: the fact that this was all laid out in a book in 1937, okay, and then he didn't know what Germany was going to do to the United States through Operation Paperclip and the military-industrial complex. Right. Okay, he didn't. No one knew because that hadn't happened yet. But when you look at it, it fits his model exactly, and it's one of the most disturbing things that I've ever read in that regard.
Yeah, you said you didn't want to address it for quite a while when you first read it.
I had started to. I was finally going to write a book about NIMSA as I see them, and this was a book that Joseph Farrell had been telling me about for a few years, and finally, when it came time that I was going to write this book on NIMSA in 2017, I realized, okay, I got to get my hands on this book and read it. And yeah, I'll admit, when I did, it's one thing, and I say this in the book, it's one thing to suspect that there's this Nazi international post-war, that the Nazi apparatus survived and they've somehow influenced our country and other countries of the world too, because remember, they went to the Soviet Union, and that they're out there and they're doing all these manipulations of all the the players. It's another thing to see historically how it happened, how it could happen, and it just really wow. I mean, I came away. I'm convinced that holy crap, Farrell and the others are right, that there is this post-war Nazi international group, and they indeed did this to us through Operation Paperclip and the building of our military-industrial complex.
Yeah,
and it's just really disturbing. So I said, no, I gotta focus on something else, and so I set it aside.
And you also mentioned that this group behind them are referred to as the Society of Lizards.
Yes.
Which is just
the
ironic.
Society of Lizards. Isn't it? Yeah, because immediately people are going to go, oh, it's the reptilians.
Right.
It's like, no. Let's calm down. However, I do think that its origins, its roots, are to be found way back in the murky past of of the era of who they call the Scythians. Okay, and so while it does have its tendrils way back then, no, we're not talking about literal reptilians. We're talking about a group, that operates on its own self-interest at all times,
right?
With essentially an objective of global domination. These would be, among the people, the groups that are all about globalization, and whatever horrors and evils come with that serve their vision. They don't care.
Right. You talk a little bit about Napoleon's. You talk a lot about Napoleon's bloodline.
Yes.
And the mystery as to who his father might actually be.
Mm-hmm.
You want to
there was question. Yeah, there was. Sure, there was openly question during his lifetime about whether Charles Bonaparte, who was actually, that's one thing a lot of people don't realize. Napoleon Bonaparte was of an Italian family born in Corsica. Okay, Napoleon was not a Frenchman. Okay, his father's name, his family names were Gallicized when he went to France at a young age to go to school. Corsica had just recently been taken over by France during Napoleon's childhood and youth, when he was born. They were fighting French forces and such. And Napoleon's father ended up working for the French government, and so that's how Napoleon came to France, was as a kid, going to school there, going to academy there. There was always question as to who his father was. People doubted that it was Carlo Bonaparte, who was known as Charles Bonaparte after they were Gallicized. And the main suspect was this Count de Marbeuf, who was one of the officers, during the years that France was essentially taking over Corsica. And they say that the Count de Marbeuf met young Letizia Remolino, Napoleon's mother, and had an affair with her, and that he was really Napoleon's father. But that's not likely. Napoleon himself pretty much laid that out and disproved that during his own lifetime. And it is found out later that because the Comte de Marbeuf, had become friends with Charles and Letizia, and had actually helped Charles with some professional issues and such, that the British made up that lie that the Count de Marbeuf was Napoleon's father. So, see, that story didn't exist in Napoleon's childhood. It didn't emerge until Napoleon was an adult and on the scene, and it was traced to British spies and propagandists and stuff. So it wasn't the Comte de Marbeuf. However, there was still question about, Charles Bonaparte, whether he was really Napoleon's father, and by extension, Joseph's father, because Napoleon and Joseph, his older brother, looked very much alike, but the rest of their siblings, who actually were the children of Charles and Letizia, didn't look so much like their older brothers, see? So the fact that there's even question about who was Napoleon's father to this day is very intriguing from the dynastic point of view, because, as I said before, you have to look at who hated and had a stake in stopping or destroying Napoleon, and I mentioned the House of Este, okay? This major dynasty upon which all the other sub-dynasties, had their connections to, and thus their loyalty. And so the obvious question is, well, what did the House of Este have to fear about Napoleon Bonaparte? Well, obviously, to me, a dynastic question. They must have been concerned that Napoleon was of a lineage who could take them on, or who would have a legitimate claim to the throne of France and the other thrones of the countries he was, defeating in these wars against him. So I looked at that. I thought, well, Okay, let's look at that. What are the clues? What are the possibilities? Well, you have a pretty obvious clue, Bird. When Napoleon himself, when a tomb of Clovis, a past French king, was opened, and there were these golden bees. Okay, Clovis's symbol was the bee, and Napoleon took those bees, and they were on his robe. They became part of his symbol, and Napoleon himself essentially pushed the idea that he was a Merovingian. Now, the Merovingian dynasty existed, I think, almost 500 years prior to the origin of the House of Este. Okay, so their claim would have predated any claim by the House of Este, particularly to France, but really anywhere else in Europe. So if Napoleon was a Merovingian, that presented a major problem to the House of Este and all the, monarchies of Europe. Now you begin to understand why, we have to stop this guy, because not only is he kicking our butt in the field of battle, okay, not only is he winning the hearts and minds of people throughout, even countries that he invades and conquers, holy crap, he might have an actual legitimate claim to these thrones that predates ours by half a millennium. We got to stop this guy because he's a threat to our good thing. Okay, so I looked at it deeper, and when I looked on his mother's side, what I found was, she also of an Italian family, and what they call a patrician family, one of the so-called original, Italian families and such. And I started looking then from the Merovingian side and followed a thread to the King of Lombard. Now, Napoleon's mother's family is a Lombard family, the region called Lombardy, which, is now part of Tuscany and such, okay? And the king that invaded Lombard, King Alboin, was a Frankish king who had married a princess named Clothsinda. Now, Clothsinda was the daughter of a Merovingian king. She was the descendant of a Merovingian king. Okay, they had one child. That daughter, Albswinda, you got to say these names carefully. I learned these old Visigoth and Ostrogoth names. Albswinda was their only child, and by blood, through her mother, she was a Merovingian princess, okay, the heir to the Merovingian dynasty and their claims. Now, here's what's interesting. Her mother, Clothsinda, dies shortly after she's born. And Alboin, one of the places he's, kicking butt in northern Italy, he kills this one king in battle, and he takes his daughter, that king's daughter, as a wife. That's Rosamund. Well, Rosamund hated him, okay, the whole time, and she takes on a lover, and they conspire to flee and go to a friendly realm to them elsewhere in Italy. And what they do to protect themselves, for their own safety, is they kidnap Princess Albswinda. Okay, I won't bore you with all the details. They go into it begins with a V, and I always forget that. But they head in the direction of Rome, but they head east. And in the end, Rosamund and her lovers are essentially found out and executed and all that. But Albswinda, okay, this Merovingian princess, is sent to Constantinople. Okay, and that's where she disappears from history. Now, subsequent to that, you have this notorious Fourth Crusade. And we know during the Fourth Crusade that Constantinople is sacked by, crusading orders of knights, including the Teutonic Knights, okay, and other knightly orders and such. The Templars are in the mix, but they weren't crazy about participating in that because they knew there was something shady going on there. But what I argue is this. I hypothesize, I speculate this, okay, that among the information, the intelligence, and the things captured in Constantinople during that crusade was likely the knowledge of the fate of Albswinda, okay, and her heirs, her descendants. And I think what happened was one of the knightly orders learned through records, genealogies that were seized, later learned, this was later, learned from the genealogies and the information seized that, wait a minute, there are heirs of Albswindas that are in northern Italy, okay, that returned to Italy and such. And I think that this bloodline extended into the Ramolinos, of which Letizia was a daughter. And so therefore I think that somebody knew that Letizia Ramolino was a descendant of Albswinda and therefore of the Merovingian dynasty. And what I propose in my book is that that this was an arranged breeding situation, okay? Somebody decided, whoever was behind this, possibly the Knights Templar, okay, possibly, and there's reasons for that. Whoever was behind this decided that, okay, we need to challenge the House of Este, we need to challenge the oligarchs of Europe, we must, in the Merovingian dynasty is our way to do it. I think a father was selected, I think a mother was selected, both of them of Merovingian blood, okay? And I think the mother selected was the young Letizia Ramolino in this particular case. And the father we still don't know. I think they were brought together. They had 4 children. Napoleon and Joseph had 2 older siblings who died in infancy. Joseph and Napoleon were the ones who survived, okay? I think those 4 children had this mystery father. But with Joseph and Napoleon surviving, they were watched through childhood, and Napoleon himself emerged as the stronger 2, the smarter, just the sharper, smarter kid, of the 2 brothers. Mm-hmm. Now, this fits an old Scottish method or system called blood tanistry, and that was a claim within a family or a clan. You were able to establish this through your own personal abilities, okay, or blood tanistry just through, fighting it out in the ring, and whoever wins, gets to claim the throne, okay? But let's set that aside, because clearly Napoleon did not kill his brother Joseph. What I'm saying is Napoleon emerging as he did clearly became, wow, this kid's really sharper than Joseph and such. I think through, this idea of tanistry, whoever had arranged this breeding experiment to begin with, and were watching these boys, saw that Napoleon was the one who was the superior child. And therefore, in my opinion, in my speculation, heavy speculation here, folks, you can reject this, therefore Napoleon was selected to be the one they would groom and move along to, hopefully become the Merovingian heir who would stand against the House of Este and all the oligarchs of Europe and England, by extension. And, they got that in spades, because as Napoleon got older and, obviously came into his own, and they saw, wow, we picked the right one of the 2. And, of course, as they say, the rest is history. But I think that's what's behind. I do suspect that Napoleon was authentically of the Merovingian dynasty, and that was really the reason why the House of Este, at any cost, had the agents of their oligarchy out there trying to stop him. That's why they were so desperate to stop him.
All right, let's get to the last bit of speculation in this book, and that's that it wasn't Napoleon who died in exile.
That's right. That is part 3 of this volume, and it's really the most fun of. Part 1 in Egypt's pretty fun too, and its implications, but part 3 is really, it's as equally mind blowing. As I read the biographies, and as little tidbits popped up, number 1, that Joseph and Napoleon resembled each other so much that they could be confused for one another at times. That's something I'd never heard of before, and I thought, wow, that's intriguing. Mm-hmm. And then there's the point at which Napoleon would use diversion. When he was going to go pull off an operation or go off and do this, that, or the other, with battle or some maneuver, he would send his hunting party with his carriage and all the retinue out into the countryside in the opposite direction, so that spies and anybody watching him would follow that, so he could slip away. And it does not specify that he used a double for himself, but you ask yourself, well, if he did all that, at some point, if spies are watching, they're going to want to see someone get out of this carriage, right? Mm-hmm. So, gosh, and it didn't necessarily have to be Joseph, because Joseph was doing things like sitting on the throne of Spain and stuff like that. He could have used multiple doubles. Also, there was hints that he probably started this practice while in Egypt with all these assassination attempts that, were going on,
right,
aimed against him. So here we have a precedent for he and his brother looked enough alike that they would get confused for each other, okay, number one. Number two, he would use diversions, essentially he would double, what appeared to be his retinue and all the stuff I just described. So we know that he would use the double-like methods, okay? And then we get to an interesting episode after he's escaped Elba the first time that he was exiled. He escapes from the island of Elba, and when he first re-engages with the military, he faces his old unit, his old original home unit, the 5th Regiment, and he says something interesting, and here's the thing. What he said exactly varies from source to source, but the gist was he stands before his soldiers, they got their rifles leveled at him, he's unarmed, and he says, hey, are you really going to, essentially, you're really going to shoot, your commander, or your emperor? And of course they don't. They end up cheering and they're glad to see him, and then we go into the famous 100 days. They welcome him back and such. But here's an interesting thing. The sources, again, don't agree on the actual words that were said. But there's a movie made in 1970 by Dino De Laurentiis, an Italian producer, in which Rod Steiger plays Napoleon. And in the film, the writers chose this dialogue. When in this scene I described, this historical event when Napoleon stands before his soldiers, they have Napoleon say, "Men of the 5th, do you know who I am?" This is interesting. This is intriguing. Was this entirely a construct, a piece of dialogue that the writers came up with? Or did they find this in a source? It's really intriguing. They say, do you know who I am? Now, ask yourself, if Napoleon has escaped Elba, at this point, he doesn't know if he's going to be met with a firing squad, okay? Or the military's been sent out there to arrest him, actually,
right?
With Commander Ney, And so if you want to be sure you're going to survive, and you've used doubles in the past and this kind of diversion and trickery, why not use a double to stand before the troops? And you would ask something like, hey, you know who I am? Just to be sure that, the ruse is working.
Right.
It's a heavy speculation. I get it. I know there's people out there rolling their eyes, but that's why we discuss these things. Consider that. So, when he gets the positive response, it would be very easy after that for the real Napoleon to have kind of, slipped back into his own identity after having used a double. Whatever was actually said, I suspect that episode, Napoleon had sent a double to make that first confrontation after returning from Elba. I think he used a double. Now, why do we think Joseph? Because there's a big, fat clue later on. After Waterloo, okay, Napoleon's fled Malmaison. He's at the port city of Rochefort, okay? Now, his brother Joseph comes to him, and Joseph tells him, and the biographical sources say this, Joseph tells him there is a an American frigate 8 miles off the coast. He introduces him to 2 American officers. He says, these 2 American naval officers are ready to take you in a small boat, a launch, to that American ship, and they will take you to Boston, to safety in America. Go now and let me turn myself in as you. Let them take me. They'll never know. And he says this. He implores this to his brother Napoleon twice. It is Joseph's idea for him to double for his brother, to the British. Okay? Joseph's idea. He's willing to sacrifice himself in this way, and he implores Napoleon to go with those American naval officers and get to safety to America. Now, you say, well, why would he do that? Okay, at the time, nobody knew that England was going to take him to St. Helena. At the time, Napoleon's side had put in the request, okay, to the Allies, who they had, surrendered to, who had, defeated them at Waterloo. They put in the request. They said, Napoleon, the emperor will abdicate, blah, blah, blah. He requests exile, permanent exile in the United States. Well, the Prussians screwed that over. They said no. They insisted that he not be allowed to go to the United States. Okay? So then the thinking was, and this is what Joseph and all of them were thinking, that he would be under house arrest on an estate in England. Okay? Northern England. Mm-hmm. So here you have Joseph thinking, well, I'll do this for my brother because I'll end up living comfy on an estate in England. And I'll be able to see, my family, and they'll be in on the roost and blah, blah, blah. Okay? Well, nobody knew until Napoleon Bonaparte, let's go back to Joseph imploring him to take the deal. Let's switch places. History tells us that Napoleon Bonaparte said, no, I'm going to trust the ethics and, the gentleman's honor of the British, and I will turn myself in. And history tells us that he turned himself in to the commander of the Bellerophon, and he was taken to England. Now, what happened in England, and I'm going to start referring to the, instead of Napoleon, I'm going to say the Bonaparte exile. What happened in England was the Bonaparte exile was not allowed to leave the ship. They were scared to death that the English people were already curious and wanted to see him. They were scared to death that if he stayed in England, and if they even let him off the ship, that he would begin to get sympathy. And so they said, no way. And that's when they informed everybody that they were taking him to St. Helena. Well, we are told Napoleon, said the Bonaparte exile, put up a big protest. Well, of course he would, especially if he was Joseph, thinking, and what happened was then, no, sorry, screw you. He's taken to this rock, this rock island, hundreds of miles off the coast of West Africa, and the rest is history. But when you look at the details, there is reason to legitimately speculate that the man on St. Helena was Joseph Bonaparte, and that the man living in the United States as Joseph Bonaparte was actually Napoleon. Now, even the Brits suspected something like this was going to happen or had happened. Okay? They had sent 2 British Navy ships to the United States while all this stuff in Rochefort was going on, expecting a ship carrying Napoleon to arrive, and they were going to blockade that from arriving and seize him. Okay? Now, later on, when, the Bonaparte exile had been on St. Helena, there was this duplicitous jerk named De Las Casas who was supposed to get in there and was going to write this biography, and, he was talking with the Bonaparte exile personally, and at one point, he expressed to the governor, the British guy running St. Helena, he expressed, gosh, if I didn't know better, I would think that this Bonaparte here on this island, who we think is Napoleon, is Joseph. He expressed that, but yet it was brushed off and such. So there is, it's not just a speculation I'm just kind of pulling out of the air.
Right.
It is a speculation with enough evidence historically to legitimately propose and legitimately entertain. And yes, I personally think that Napoleon took the offer, okay, and he got on that American frigate and came to the United States. Or he subsequently arrived. We know the history of when Joseph arrived. I think Napoleon, whether he took that frigate, and I discuss the details in the book, But at some point, when you look at the history of Joseph Bonaparte arriving in America, in my opinion, it was actually Napoleon on the ship that brought Joseph.
Okay.
But he did. I think he took the deal. I think the United States Navy helped hide him during the time that Joseph was turning himself in as Napoleon to the British, and then subsequently, Napoleon did indeed arrive in the United States as Joseph.
All right, and there's a lot more to this. I mean, we've done basically a very light overview of the amount of stuff you have in this book. This is one of your longer books, isn't it?
Well, no, actually, it's 331 pages.
Yeah,
it's almost exactly the same length as the Burton book. So
okay.
yeah, it is and it isn't. I mean, I actually have a few others as long as this, but in the end, by the time Volume 2 is done,
right.
If I were to put it as one book, it would definitely be it would be the longest one. So by default, it will end up being the longest one I've written.
And when do you think Volume 2 might be out?
I'm hoping to have it out a year after this book came out, by late January, mid-February of 2020.
Okay.
I have begun the official pulling together the sources, and because I've identified those questions that I need to answer in the threads I want to pull and go back. Already from writing the first book, there's the additional research and stuff. So I'm hoping for a little less than a year from now, but it might be, it might take me a year from now before that's out and ready.
Okay. And this is obviously the next thing you're working on.
Well, no, I'm going to hopefully crank out some fiction.
Oh.
But as far as nonfiction, yeah, this will be, because I will have spent, over 2 years dedicated to Napoleon.
Wow.
By the time this second volume is done, and that's next to the Empire of the Wheel, which was a 7-year effort, but it was actually almost 2.5, almost 3 years of research before I wrote Empire of the Wheel 1, before I began writing it. So, this Napoleon research for me will be second only to the initial Empire of the Wheel investigation. It's quite. It completely changed my perception of Napoleon Bonaparte. I raise my hand. I am among the Napoleon admirers. I have great admiration for this man. This man is one of the greatest and most slandered people in world history, and it's just awful.
Yeah, it's a very interesting read, and of course, very well written, as all your books are.
Thank you.
Where can people get it?
Only one place. That's lulu.com, LULU.com, and it's print on demand. It takes about a week to 10 days or so to get your book, but it's worth it. You get a printed book in your hand, and I'm very proud of this book. I'm very excited about it. It's really, I think, one of the most fascinating things I've ever worked on. And I really think that people, once they dig into it and read it, they'll see why and how the speculations are justified. And I think they'll learn, they'll be introduced to a Napoleon Bonaparte they never knew.
Yeah, very true. All right, where can people follow you and find you?
Oh, I have a blog that I don't update a lot, but it is there, and there's some great things there, and I hope this summer to throw a bunch of new stuff on there, empireofthewheel.blogspot.com. You can interact with me at Twitter or Facebook, but also I have the Walter Bosley channel at YouTube, where I get on and I just do casual chats and conversations and stuff about the things I research and other things I'm interested in, and that's Sundays at 5:30 is when it's live at the Walter Bosley channel at YouTube. So I'm out there, and I'll be, let's see, I've been asked to speak at a secret space program conference that will be a year from now, next spring. There's another paranormal type conference. I don't know the full details yet. Looks like late September I'll be speaking at, and I will be at a table signing books at Contact in the Desert with my good friend Olaf Phillips of Paranoia Magazine, and that'll be fun. I think we've done that before. So
nice. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for spending time with us again. Always great having you on.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, and I really appreciate the interest, and I look forward to talking with you again.
And a special shout out to our patrons pledging $10 or more: Allison Cook, Lindsay Marie Trebet, Nick Martin, Super Inframan, UFO Weekly News, Tim, Maria, Nate Syria, Jennifer Campbell, Mike McGuire, American Rambler, Paul Buscini, Kevin, Chris Johnson, 36 Dingo, John Rutledge Foster, Eric Citron, Ben Crow, Janet Runyon, Andy McNamara, Sasha Lorg, Christopher Vaughn, Riker and Stark, Rogelio Gonzalez, Anthony Sullivan, Roland Belstadt, Robert Groom, Sean Cosgrove, Jose A., Craig Cisternos, Charles Beauregard, Matthias Sunby, Lindsey Jackson K., Alfred Tuttle, Kevin Schreck, Patricia Giaquinta, William Lovelace, Mark Brady, Chris, John Eddy, and Carla Mahoney. Thank you all so very much. All right, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Walter. I'm going to try, no promises, the universe tends to conspire against plans. I'm going to try and get back up to 2 shows a week. We already had another one up the other night with listener stories, and I have some other ones planned, and hopefully we'll be able to do that. I have some Patreon content as well, not from Walter this time because we didn't have time, but some extra stuff I'm going to be putting up, plus the audio from the Bigfoot game that I put the video up for patrons, where we talk about Tim and Joshua's upcoming book on Bigfoot while we play the Bigfoot board game. You can watch the 360 video of that in the patron section, but I'll put the audio only up for people who don't want to sit through the video, and we'll see you next time.
The end of the world. Part of a man, hair of a girl. Nazi stained with a lot of juice. Once got hit in the face with a goose. He's fabulous. He's dangerous. On my bended knees, my apologies. He's not dangerous. With the words to utter, except I can't believe it's not butter. Teach you how to be a good lover. It's not just another romance book cover. He's fabulous. He's dangerous. On my bended knees, my apologies. He's not dangerous. He's got golden flowing locks, with a chest as hard as rocks. He's a manly kind of man, and I am his biggest fan. He's fabulous, he's dangerous. On my bended knees, my apologies. He's not dangerous. Ha!
You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons, and we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can always find everything Where Did the Road Go related at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And thank you so much for your support.